Since most of you weren't at the papers earlier, let me just say a couple of words about the origin of the conference and then describe what we're going to do. So the conference originated from a Greenberg seminar on Shakespeare and the Law that Richard Posner and I have taught, along with help from Richard Strier of the English department, for the past 2 years. And we began thinking the law and literature movement has not done anything new lately, and it's in need of a boost, and contemporaneously with the fact that Richard Posner's Law and Literature is coming out in the 3rd edition, we thought it would be very good to coordinate this with the conference. So we were very, very lucky to convince Justice Breyer to be our honored guest. And he has selected the 3 plays that we did scenes from just now. That is Hamlet, Measure for Measure, and As You Like It. And so what we're going to do is that he's going to say a few words in the beginning about why he chose those plays and about his origins of his interest in Shakespeare. Then each of us will take a few minutes just saying something about our own interest in the plays and how we might connect the plays to law in the following order: Strier, Posner, Nussbaum, and Breyer. And then we're going to open it to questions from the floor. So when you have questions, you can go to one of the 2 microphones over there, and that way everyone will hear you and you'll be recorded and all that. So welcome, and just tell us, why did you choose these 3 plays?
I like them. I guess I'm not an expert on law and literature. I chose As You Like It because I love this play. It's about love. And I love Rosalind. And I think sometimes that Rosalind, when I see my daughters and so forth, embodies a problem that intelligent women have had forever. And I happened to see Siegfried, the opera, not too long ago, and there's this wonderful duet between Brunhilde and Siegfried, and there she has this problem. The problem is, she says, I'm peaceful, I'm happy, leave me alone. But my God, there's passion, and I'm going to have to get married. And it used to be particularly difficult, because for an intelligent woman in particular, I mean, what do I do here? He's going to run my life. And, oh, but he's so good looking. Oh. And here we have Beatrice, and we have Rosalind. And Rosalind hits on the solution. She'll teach him. She'll teach him. And I'm a teacher, so I like that. And what does it remind me of? Groundhog Day. Have you seen Groundhog Day? That's it. You'll do it till you get it right. That is the solution for the intelligent woman. All right, now, Measure for Measure, probably it came into my mind because it seems to be about law. But then I'm not certain it's about law. Because when I read it, actually, I read the word measure is not measure for measure, but proportion. And all these people are out of proportion. It's a mess. Nobody's doing the right thing. I mean, the king, the duke is leaving. The whole city is poor. They're all running off to brothels. Nobody gets married anymore. There's these little illegitimate children running over. Instead of getting married, Isabel goes to a monastery. No, she goes to a convent. And my goodness, he picks somebody who is really just terrible, Angelo, to run this city, who can't control himself or anything else. And can law help here? No, not really. But moderation can, and proportion can. So I thought there could be a discussion about that. And why Hamlet? Well, why Hamlet? That's an absurd question to answer. But I think you do see things differently as you get older, and you reread things. And each time something appears to you differently. And this time, I think what appealed to me suddenly, I thought of, well, this is really about 2 things. And of course, I can say it's really about, because you see, it isn't my profession to be involved in Shakespeare. And whereas anyone who is in that field as a profession wouldn't dare say it's really about. But since I'm a total amateur, I can say anything. So I think that what it's about, in large part, or at least it made me think of this, is a certain progression the progression from to be or not to be to readiness is all. And then I think of the progression really in Aeschylus, the Orestii, from the law of revenge to we're going to bring justice in, and he tells a story along the way. And what appealed to me as an older person is at the very end, what does he want? He wants Horatio to tell this story. He wants what story? To justify himself? Not necessarily. Maybe to tell the story of what happened to him spiritually throughout this play. And at the end, he says, which I'll leave you, I don't know what this one word means, but I think this one word is important to me now. And he says, when Fortinbras comes in, please, please, you tell this story too, for you will repeat it. He says it in much better English. And then he says, silence. Yeah. Well, okay, so we know there is everything in Shakespeare, even law. But those were the reasons that I picked these three stories.
Okay, thanks very much. And now we'll each just say something about the themes in those plays that interest us most. So, Richard.
Well, I'm happy to say, as a supposed professional in this field, that I think the plays are really about things also. And I think it's good to think the plays are really about things, because I think that Shakespeare was interested in issues. I mean, we have to imagine Shakespeare in composition. Well, what do we know about his means of composition? Every play, with the exception of two, has a narrative or dramatic source. So here's this guy, he's reading and reading and reading and reading, and the sources are all sorts of things. Classical histories, little trashy novels, other plays, etc., etc., etc. He's looking for material. He has to produce 2 plays a year for a while, and then eventually a little less than 1 play a year, but he's constantly got to produce these plays, got to produce scripts, dramatic poems to be performed. So he's reading, reading, reading. One of the reasons that I find the very charming movie Shakespeare in Love rather silly is that they show Shakespeare doing absolutely everything except the one thing we know he did, aside from be in plays and write plays, is read books. So we have to imagine Shakespeare's reading, and he's reading, reading, reading. Presumably he read more books than he used as sources. So how does he decide I'm going to write a play on the basis of a little Italian novel, and it's going to be Othello? Or I'm going to write a play on a familiar story, like King Lear or Hamlet. Or I'm going to redo some stories about English history. Well, I think something he would read, and something caught his attention in the sense of it made him intellectually interested. I think that issues caught his mind. He said, okay, what can I see in this story? Obviously he's interested in characters, but he's interested in characters within situations. So this seems to me a good way to reach Shakespeare, to ask, well, what are the issues that interested him in this story? So that, for instance, in As You Like It, one of the things that helped me in thinking about how the play might be relevant to this kind of occasion was the little scene that we did, where the issue of violence towards a community that you assume is very alien to your own is not what you expect. And this scene seems to me quite an important lesson in not assuming that the unexpected and unofficial is uncivilized. So part of the interest of a scene like this is that this guy who bursts in is accused not of being a bad person, but of incivility. Here they are in the middle of the forest, and he's accused of incivility. And the key words in this are incivility, gentleness. So it seems to me there's some kind of serious thought there about how social values can appear in places where you might not expect them. And I think this has relevance to colonial situations, all sorts of situations, that I think is not a stretch to see Shakespeare interested in. Now, something that I'd want to say about Hamlet, and that again seems relevant to this particular gathering, is it seems to me Hamlet is a play very interested in the issue of evidence. Well, on what basis can you know something, and on what basis are you prepared to act on something? And it seems to me one of the things that's extremely interesting in the play is, while we know Hamlet actually gets something right, namely that Claudius did in fact kill Hamlet Sr., he never has any good evidence for this. He's told about it by this thing, which claims to be the ghost of his father released from purgatory. Well, England is a dominantly Protestant country that doesn't believe in purgatory, number one. So 2/3 of the audience is going to be absolutely suspicious, going to think, this can't be a figure from purgatory. There's no such thing. It's a devil, which of course Horatio says, and Hamlet comes to consider. Even if it were, even if you were a Catholic and believed in figures from purgatory, when, first of all, mostly people don't come back from purgatory, they stay there. You pray for them. They don't come back. But when they do come back, when the stories where they do come back, there's only one thing they say. They say, pray for me so I can get out of here. Because purgatory got more and more hell-like as the Middle Ages progressed. So they're trying that. So if someone's going to come back from purgatory, they're going to say, pray for me, not go kill somebody. So he has this. So he gets this dubious advice from this dubious thing, which is often referred to as the thing in the first act. And then he says, okay. He gets this bizarre idea, which only somebody who was a humanistically trained scholar would believe, that somehow literature is more powerful than life. So this guy who's perfectly happy to commit a murder, to kill his brother, etc., is somehow or other going to be so moved by a play that he's going to cough up his guilt. It's completely ridiculous. It's the kind of thing. The only context in which this appears is defenses of literature. So Shakespeare's been reading, or Hamlet's been reading Sidney, and there's a story like this in Sidney. So he thinks, okay, I believe this. So now often people think it worked. But at a crucial moment in all this, Hamlet makes a disastrous slip of the tongue and describes the murderer in the play within the play as the nephew rather than the brother of the king, and thereby absolutely confuses the experiment, because we don't know what Claudius is responding to. He might be responding to Hamlet, his nephew, just saying he's going to kill him. So the point at which Hamlet thinks he's got conclusive evidence, we, as people watching the play, know he doesn't, even though we know he's right, because the next scene is the scene in which Claudius confesses his guilt. But of course, it's in a soliloquy. Nobody hears this but God, us, and the speaker. So the whole question of evidence seems to me sort of wonderfully rich in Hamlet. Now, Measure for Measure, it's sort of obviously a play very interested in issues about law and regulation and whatnot. But the one piece of it that I want to point to, which I think was in the scene that or was mentioned in the scene that we did. This is when Angelo says to Aeschylus, "What knows the laws that thieves do pass on thieves?" So this seems to be a perfectly intelligible bit of legal formalism, that it doesn't matter who's in the jury as long as the laws operate properly. What knows the laws that thieves do pass on thieves? It's just a system that has to operate. I think Shakespeare was very troubled by this issue. And my dear friend Judge Posner thinks that the Sermon on the Mount is one of the silliest utterances ever produced, and only relevant to its immediate apocalyptic context, which is in a way, I think, true. Nonetheless, though, it's something that had an enormous effect on Western culture from the time of its peculiar production, And somehow this issue of the corrupt judge, even in the face of an awareness of legal formalism as perfectly intelligible, I think really troubled Shakespeare, and I think was part of the motive for this play. So I'll stop there.
Actually, the comment about the Sermon on the Mount is from one of my favorite 19th century English judges, James Fitzjames Stephen, the uncle of Virginia Woolf. What he said was that the Sermon on the Mount is a pathetic overstatement of duties. That's exactly right.
Told you.
So I want to make 2 points. Well, it's beautiful nonsense, right? It makes sense if you actually think the world is going to end, before your next mortgage payment is due. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So I do want to emphasize one point about the law and literature movement, which is that it's a lot more than what we've been doing today and be doing tomorrow. So here we're focusing on works of literature that have law as their theme, maybe incidental theme, but somehow touch on law. But there are other really interesting aspects of it. One is the use of literature and the techniques of literature and analyses in literary criticism that would help lawyers and judges to do better writing, more persuasive. So there have been they're very interesting discussions in modern literary criticism of narrative techniques, and that's something that lawyers and judges can, I think, really learn about. And there's actually a very interesting opinion by Justice Souter in a case called Old Chief, in which he actually uses, I don't know whether deliberately or not, but uses a narrative theory to reach an interesting, I think, correct result having to do with the federal rules of evidence. So in addition, there have been attempts, they're interesting, I don't find them terribly convincing, but I think they're very interesting, to use notions of literary interpretation to help in the interpretation of statutes and constitutional provisions. So that's very interesting. And also there have been efforts to take works of literature which really aren't about law as such, but which somehow provides a kind of background understanding to problems that lawyers and judges encounter. And a very interesting example of this is a book, probably largely forgotten by Eric Maria Remarque, called Arch of Triumph, which is about a refugee in France, a German refugee in France on the eve of World War II. And I happened to reread it a few months ago, and I thought it illuminated the plight of the paperless refugee in a way relevant to the asylum cases that had become a major area of federal jurisdiction, federal adjudication in our court. But of course, the largest emphasis of the law and literature movement has been on what we've been doing, which is exploring legal themes in literary works. Now, I have to say that I understand why law is such a common theme in literature. It's a pretty ubiquitous institution in society, ancient as well as modern. And also trials are very dramatic, so they really lend themselves to presentation in literature. And there are many wonderful works of literature that have law for their theme and covering a wide variety. I'll just mention a couple of modern books. I don't know how many of you have read them, but really good books about law. One of them is a novel by Joyce Carol Oates, an early novel of hers called Do With Me What You Will. Another is a novel by William Gaddis called A Frolic of His Own. I mean, these are really terrific books. And many others, Stendhal and Camus and Kafka, and then, of course, the Greek tragedians and so on. But I don't really think law is the most interesting aspect of any of these works. Obviously the authors, the writers, they're using law, as a foil or as a background, and they're playing with the law. They're changing the law, making up law, as in a play like The Merchant of Venice. I don't think you learn much about law. What I've thought more interesting about these works of literature about law is that they provide insights into jurisprudence. So, like Measure for Measure is dealing with a perennial problem of balance between rules, strict rules, and looser notions, standards, concepts of equity that bend strict rules. And Angelo, in his speech that you heard a little while ago, he articulates a kind of legal formalism, which is quite interesting and actually makes, when he says, I don't have it exactly, but I pity most the persons I don't know when I apply strict rules. What he's saying is there's always a danger that the judge is going to be so moved by the plight of a particular party before him that he'll adopt a rule which actually has bad consequences for more people, but they're the people who aren't before the court, so they're less salient in his thinking. So even though he's a wicked guy, Angelo, and of course, one of the great things about Shakespeare, he always gives villains really good lines. Right? So you have to think, the great speech by the bastard Edmund in King Lear. Edmund is a real devil. But what he talks about, bastards aren't we as good as, people born in the stale bed of a married couple or in a society of arranged marriages for aristocrats. So he makes a lot of great points. But he's still very wicked. So in Hamlet, the jurisprudential interest, I'm touching on things that Justice Breyer and Professor Strier were saying, focuses on revenge, which is a stage in the evolution of law and actually remains important. If you ask why victims of crime will cooperate with the police and prosecutors, even though in most cases they have no financial stake in cooperation, revenge is a factor. The support of the death penalty is, I think, motivated by a feeling of revenge, which is very deep in people, I think really genetic. But so in Hamlet you have a critique of revenge, and I'm using critique in a precise sense. Now, it's not just critical, it's an effort to look at both sides of the problem. I do disagree very strongly with Professor Strier, and I'll explain why. I think Hamlet has two incompatible duties. I think he goes seriously. I think you have to take the go seriously. It's really Hamlet's father. It's not a devil. I mean, just look at him. So there's a duty of revenge laid on him by his father. And of course, it's very understandable because you can't invoke any laws. Claudius controls the laws of Denmark. So when the legal system is ineffectual, that's when the pressure for revenge is really strong. So he's under a heavy duty. On the other hand, of course, the New Testament says, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." Now, what exactly that means, whether you can have some delegation to human beings, that's a big issue. The deeper problem with revenge is that, it's a self-help system. The victim, or his family maybe, has the duty of revenge, and yet these people are not necessarily well-equipped by temperament or experience or skills to be law enforcers. And you see that in Hamlet. We have three revengers, major revengers. There's a minor one in the recitation by the players before the play. Pyrrhus, we'll forget Pyrrhus, but you have Hamlet, Laertes, and Fortinbras, and they're very nicely compared. So Hamlet is too hesitant, too cool to be a really effective revenger. Laertes is too hot, too impulsive, so he's no good as a revenger either. And the mean, the golden mean, is Fortinbras, who's perfectly cast to be a revenger. But the problem is, he is perfectly cast because of his extraordinarily high notion of honor, which leads him, in I guess the fourth act, to be willing to sacrifice an army to capture a few acres of worthless ground. So we see problems with revenge. But although I think Hamlet is interesting as a critique of revenge, that I don't think is the greatest interest of the play, which in my opinion is by far Shakespeare's best play. And since I'm not a professional, I'm not required to admire all of Shakespeare's plays. I think actually they cover quite a range in quality. But Hamlet, to me, is the very best. But what makes it great is not the revenge motif. It's just a great play about relationships, about personality and character, about styles of being in the world. It's about a profoundly dysfunctional family. And it also has the great theme of maturation. There's a famous essay many years ago by Maynard Mack pointing out that Hamlet undergoes a mysterious but decisive change between the first three acts before his aborted voyage to England and then the last two acts. So he's impulsive, immature, in the first three acts, occasionally violent. In the last two acts, he seems to be a different personality, to be fatalistic in a way, to be accepting of the lack of control that people have over their fates. And it's really fantastic. And it's also what I particularly like about, or one of the things I particularly like about Hamlet, and this is true in many Shakespeare's plays, it has an almost musical structure. So you have the three revenge plots, and for a playwright to be able to handle the three parallel plots without repetition or tedium and somehow intertwine them is remarkable. And I'll mention just a little parallel. I mean, it's full of parallels and ingenious touches. And, has such dramatic variety. It has the play within a play. It has 7 killings, I think. It has a ghost. It's got everything. But just so as you saw about an hour ago, I was killed by Hamlet. And that's foreshadowed in a curious way, because there's what seems to be a completely idle remark, much earlier in the play about Polonius, about how he acted Julius Caesar. It's a funny reference to another play by Shakespeare, but he acted Julius Caesar and was stabbed to death in the Capitol. And of course, that's what's going to happen to Polonius. So he foreshadows his death. And that's the kind of ingenious touch that makes it such a charming play. So let me just explain very, very briefly why I do not agree that Shakespeare, that there's any doubt about the authenticity of the ghost. I don't really think an Elizabethan audience would be bothered by encountering purgatory, because the play is supposed to be about medieval Denmark, before the Reformation. So whatever strange religious customs they encounter, I don't think would trouble his audience. But I experienced a kind of arrested development in terms of literary appreciation as an undergraduate. So I was an undergraduate at Yale, an English major, in the 50s, when the new criticism was the dominant style of literary criticism not everywhere, of course, but certainly at Yale. Yale was the hotbed of criticism, and of the new criticism, it was called. And Cleanth Brooks was a famous new critic, was my senior thesis advisor, and the The basic premise of the new criticism was that a work of literature should be interpreted in such a way as to make it the best aesthetic object that it could be. It didn't matter, it wasn't to be looked at as a source of philosophy, source of ideas, source of ethics, source of history. It wasn't to be judged by any of those external criteria. It was to be judged the way you might judge a work of music, an abstract painting, something without a heavy context in history and ideas and so on. And there's a famous crack by T.S. Eliot about Henry James, that he had a mind too, I'm not sure how exactly, he had a mind too fine to be, that it could be violated by an idea. And what he meant was that the task of a writer, of an artist, is not ideas, it's not analysis. If they use ideas, they're tools to make a work of art, and the accuracy, the historicity, the consistency of the ideas is really secondary, unless it's a strongly didactic work of literature, which I don't regard Shakespeare as being. And it seems to me that if the ghost is a phony, is a fake, I don't know, it makes the play kind of pointless. It makes Hamlet a terrible dupe. It says, well, look, this guy Hamlet, he didn't realize there's no purgatory. So the ghost has to be fake. And so he kills and he dies at the end, all because of some mistake he made. And I think it diminishes the play to think of it in those terms. And I say I use aesthetic rather than historical criteria to evaluate works of literature.
Okay, well, as a philosopher, I work a lot on the emotions, and I have been working a lot on the role of emotions such as anger, fear, compassion, and disgust in the law. So, of course, that's a very good reason to turn to works of literature, because you find very complicated and nuanced and deep explorations of human emotions and how they work, and so that is what I'm going to talk about now. I think there are so many other things that are of interest in these plays, but I think Measure for Measure and Hamlet, which were written very close to each other in Shakespeare's career, have a similar focus on sexuality as fearful and disgusting and a danger to good order and political authority. So in Measure for Measure, which was written around the time of a plague in London that actually led to the closing of the theaters for a while in 1603, we see that there's a link between the sex trade and disease, and the closing of the sex businesses with the re-establishment of public health and public order. And so successful is the fictional regime depicted in the play in making that link that Claudio, who, remember, as I wrote in the synopsis before we performed the scenes, has actually, his great crime is to have intercourse with his own fiancée, to whom he would have been married but for some dispute about dowry. Even Claudio thinks of their own sexual acts as both dangerous and disgusting. He describes people's sexual desires, including his own, as, quote, rats that ravin down their proper bane, a thirsty evil, and when we drink, we die. Now that's very striking, and it is a very classic image of the disgusting, and I'll come to that in a minute. So the procurer, Lucio, brilliantly played by Guillaume a little while ago, is the only one in the play who uses positive metaphors for sexuality, images of fertility and growth. But of course he's due to be suppressed, and he's going to lose his livelihood, and his positive attitude to sexuality is certainly part of the disease that this regime is determined to combat. Now, I think the play, I mean, who knows what we can say about Shakespeare's attitude, but at any rate, the play lets us see that the disgust with which people view sexuality is profoundly irrational. And there's no more risk of catching a disease in the brothel than there is of catching it in the theater. And of course, that comparison would have been on people's minds at the time. But unfortunately, most people in most times and places do not think of risk rationally and weigh the costs and benefits. And we know that today this is so, and that sex businesses, the bathhouses in New York and other sex clubs in various places have been closed down with equally flimsy arguments about so-called public health nuisance. And if you really were to look at it and ask where is the risk, and is it really a bigger risk than some other dangerous things that people engage in, you probably would get a negative answer. But people allow their phobic reactions to sexuality to determine what the law ought to be. And so I think that's a very significant issue for law. In Hamlet, it's the sexual relationship between Gertrude and Claudius that's led to apparently murder and the toppling of legitimate political authority. And as numerous critics have remarked about the play, we don't see much about Gertrude from her own point of view, so to speak. And as I thought of playing it as an actress, I thought, Gertrude really doesn't know about the murder, and she's probably not so bad. She really is enjoying her newfound sexuality with this new husband, and she really kind of wants to have some fun in life, and she probably isn't such a bad person. But of course, that's not the way Hamlet sees her, and I think what this scene we played is about Hamlet's view of his mother and his mother's sexuality. His view of life in general throughout the play is suffused with images of disgust at the female body in general, and of course his mother's body in particular. Janet Edelman has written brilliantly about this, and I recommend that chapter of her book to anyone who wants to follow this further. He finds his mother's sexuality something that's filthy, for which he uses all these images of sticky, slimy animals and so on. And then he feels himself contaminated by the fact that he's been born of such a body. Remember that he tells Ophelia to go to a nunnery so that she won't be a breeder of sinners. And, this theme interests me a lot because there has been a long tradition of talking about a good, allegedly good role for disgust in law. Lord Devlin in the 1950s and our own University of Chicago colleague Leo Cass quite recently, when he was head of the President's Council for Bioethics, have both said that the disgust of an average person is a sufficient reason to make something illegal, even if it causes no harm to others. But by now there's a large psychological literature, experimental literature on disgust, which really does corroborate what this play suggests, namely that people's disgust is quite irrational and erratic, and that it often tracks an anxiety that they feel about their own animal nature and their own animal bodies, and that sexuality, and women's sexuality in particular, is very often a focus of that anxiety. So I think, we are given in the play reasons which the psychology then further corroborates to view disgust with great skepticism, and to think that the disgust of an average person might actually not be a good reason at all to make something illegal. Of course, people find various different themes in the plays, and there are critics who see Measure for Measure as a play that focuses on quite different topics, Christian mercy and so on, and that is certainly a theme in the play. But I think the theme of political control over human sexuality is a very important theme, at least in those plays, and I think we can now in law articulate in our post-Millian age, we can perhaps articulate better than Mill himself did some reasons why we would have not to follow the tradition of, Fitzjames Stephen really began it, and then Devlin and Cass. And if we understand how disgust operates and how it is linked with misogyny and also with racism and the subordination of various other groups who are found disgusting, we probably have some good reasons to mistrust it as a guide to law. Just a word about As You Like It. I think very, very different play, as Justice Breyer has very nicely brought out, a play that interestingly, where the women are free and they're not viewed as disgusting by anyone. And Edelman remarks on the fact that that's only It only happens when somehow we're outside the city and women somehow transform themselves into boys. It's only then that their bodies escape from this the gaze of disgust. But in any case, it's a very different play, and the characters are forced outside the legal realm, and they're forced to improvise. And I think as they do that, we do see them, and here I'll get back to Richard Strier's remarks about civility, discovering some important things about how people should treat each other, about common human vulnerability, and the importance of supporting basic bodily need, which is a major theme in King Lear, which we haven't talked about. Certainly, there was much discussion of basic human need in Elizabethan England, surrounding the Corn Laws and various other proposals to relieve hunger and misery. So the theme of hunger and the need to be gentle and gracious to people who are in need is very nicely treated in the play. And I would see in this thought that, well, we all have our experiences of loss and unhappiness, and we therefore should use that experience to be gentle and compassionate to other people. That's a kind of proto-Rousseauian reflection, if you will, on the role that a kind of reflection about our common vulnerability can have in thinking, at least beginning to think, about what laws in the area of distribution and redistribution ought to be. So now I'll turn it over to Justice Breyer for anything that he wants to say.
Well, as the ghost, I can assure you, I was authentic. There was a ghost. I mean, comment on the... I pretty much... Dick, I agree with a lot. Particularly, I like what you said very much. A novel is an aesthetic object. That's why we read it. I mean, we can have all kinds of interesting discussions about them. But basically, that's what I think of it, too. Then you said that... that doesn't mean it doesn't have ideas, and it doesn't mean that philosophy is irrelevant. I like Camus, and the reason I think Camus is a great novelist is because he speaks to me about morality. And there he is. He's a moralist. And, of course, and maybe Conrad is too. Though Conrad thinks that he is primarily writing aesthetically. So I don't separate those. In some books, the ideas and the thought play in, and the morality of it plays in much more. Maybe Jane Austen. Anyway, you can go down that line endlessly. What do I disagree then? If the ghost is a fake, then Hamlet is a dupe. But I don't think the point was the ghost is a fake. I think the point was Hamlet isn't sure. And I think there's very good reason for his not being sure. And it's then he's not sure. That's why I said once to my nephew, my wife's nephew, who teaches philosophy, I said, I've finally found out who Hamlet really is. And he said, who? I said, Hamlet is a judge. And he said, no, Hamlet is a philosophy professor. And I said, no, I think now he's a law professor. Why? Because he's looking for truth. That's what I was thinking of. He's looking for truth. And by the time he's pretty sure what the truth is, it doesn't really matter that much anymore. And that now I see he is a judge. And there we are. It doesn't matter because he has just the new attitude that Dick mentions. Then the only other thing I could find that I might want to disagree with is his Goldilocks and the Three Bears theory of revenge. Do you remember that? He said it's either too hot, too cold, or just right. I don't think I buy into Goldilocks or the Three Bears because I do think the three theories of revenge are there. But I think that, Fortinbras, who knows? I mean, Fortinbras isn't there that much, and it is true that he does, he tries to get revenge. Maybe he was going to conquer all of Denmark, we're not certain. I wouldn't give him permission to go over my kingdom. I'm not sure if he'll stop or not, and Laertes is rather pathetic and does, in fact, and however he pardons everybody, he's sorry. And Hamlet is not after revenge at the end, really, because he's ready. Readiness is everything, or all, or whatever it is he says. So I basically agree. more than I disagree. And I think the others are there as a counterpoint, not exactly. But really, I think the interesting thing is, are they speaking to us, is Shakespeare speaking to us as judges? No. Well, no. Well, you see, and then Dick pointed out, because he noticed the very thing I noticed exactly in that performance. The very same thing. And it was emphasized because the law book was there. We're speaking to the 298 million Americans who aren't in that courtroom. Wow, how often I've used that line. And how often I've justified all kinds of things by it. And how often, and there it is, right there in Measure for Measure. So now he's spoken to me as a judge. But of course, when I read it, I'm not sure he knows what to do about it any more than I do. Because, in fact, what has he told him? Angela's the one who said it, so he must be wrong in relying on it. Yes, he is there, but after all, Claudio didn't do anything wrong. I mean, and moreover, Angelo's pardoned, but he didn't kill anybody. And he didn't even sleep with the wrong person. And indeed, once you pointed out it wasn't even slander, of course they shouldn't kill Lucio. He didn't commit a crime. So the easy cases come out right in Measure for Measure. But now let's look at the hard case. What do we do with the brothels? Because he's not quite prepared to say, in a world where there are lots of illegitimate children, that brothels should be legalized, but he is prepared to say, let's not overdo this. That's it. Let's not overdo it. But legalize, I'm not sure. And what happens to Pompey? He gets off, but with a warning, don't come back. And so I say, yes, the sentiment is there. The sentiment of a judge is there, and we don't quite know what to do about that. Don't rely upon the 300 million people not being in this room too heavily, but don't give it up either. So I say, thank you, Shakespeare. You have reinforced my instinct as a judge. Where am I overall with Shakespeare? I read years ago. Kittredge. I've never gotten beyond this. Kittredge said, and I can't quote it, unfortunately. I just have to do it by giving you the idea, which is much worse than what he said. He said it beautifully. But he said, here is a man who knows every human being, every kind of human being, every different kind of character. He knows what they want. He knows how they think. He knows how they behave. And he expresses every one of those characteristic thoughts, methods of behavior, intuitions, and understanding in ways that they themselves couldn't do, though it is them. And he does it all in poetry.
Okay, now we have probably about 15 or maybe even 20 minutes for questions. So people who have questions, step up to one of the microphones and address your questions to a particular panelist if you can.
Can I just say a word about the dupe business?
Yes, while people are doing that, you should respond. Yes.
Well, first of all, there's no doubt the thing is there. So it's not an illusion, certainly not in the first act, since everyone sees it, including a skeptic. The spirit that I have seen may be a devil. So that this is Hamlet talking. This is not something that's being laid onto the play. But the question is, well, what does it mean if let's say there is at least this ambiguity, or even maybe a certainty that it's a demon, and Hamlet is acting without sufficient evidence, even though he's right. It seems to me this is part of what makes the play a tragedy. I agree with Dick that criticism should make the play the best aesthetic object it can be. On my view, adding this element of uncertainty, perhaps even adding this element of mistakenness, deepens the tragedy and is part of what makes it such a deeply, deeply sad and moving play. So anyhow, I think that the view that I'm suggesting doesn't necessarily harm the aesthetic appreciation of the play.
Okay.
That's not my conception of tragedy.
My
My conception
we
of
have such
tragedy.
limited time for questions.
Okay, I
I
just
think.
want to. My conception.
This is what the class was like.
My conception of tragedy is it deals with insoluble dilemmas, not with some mistake someone makes.
Okay, Katrina is waiting at the mic.
This question really can be for anyone on this panel. Where do you think that Angelo went wrong? Was it in his rigid adherence to the rule of law or the corruption that he experienced with his desire for Isabella?
Well, I think he had an exaggerated sense of the need to, adhere to absolutely strict rules. And of course, the fact that he turns out to be so brittle is his undoing. It's interesting. At the very beginning of the play, he doesn't want to be put in charge when the Duke is taking this little vacation. He knows he's a number 2 guy. He doesn't like to make decisions. That's why he retreats behind this, the law made me do it idea. He doesn't want to exercise discretion. He's very brittle. This business of what the Duke does, this is taken right out of Machiavelli's The Prince. That is, if you want to do some dirty, unpopular business, you want to do something unpopular, you delegate it to an underling. He cleans up. He's very unpopular. Then you kill him.
One of the papers we heard this afternoon. I think there's several different places where he goes wrong. Constance Jordan's paper earlier this afternoon, I think, showed very successfully that there is a lot of talk about how you read laws and an appeal to Aristotle to say you should read them in the light of what would the lawgiver say about this case if the lawgiver were present. Now, so one of the things he does is to read the law so strictly that this case of Claudio's falls within it, where if the lawgiver were present, he might have read it to make an exception for that case. Second thing is the severity of the sentence, which is, I think, a separate issue. And Isabella says, look, even if he's guilty, you shouldn't punish it with death. You should be more merciful. And then, of course, stepping one step back, which is what I wanted to do here, I think there is reason to call into question the whole idea that there should be laws against fornication. I mean, the play shows that this is inspired by some sort of fear and bogus arguments about contagion and so on. But why on earth should a person be punished for sleeping with a woman who consents? So I think at that level there's issues too.
I have a question. Do you play at Isabella marry the Duke?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions? I hope the participants will join in at this point, and other faculty.
Guess we said everything. Could I say something?
Kenji wants to say something. Kenji, if you can step to the mic. Kenji Yoshino, who's giving a paper tomorrow.
This is a pretty light question, but it is inspired by what Breyer said about Shakespeare, which is to say, if Shakespeare described every kind of person, and we believe that, then he described all the people on the panel too. So, we know. So, you see where I'm going with this, which is to say, I'm going to ask you which of the characters in the play you most identify with and why. But while you're thinking, let me just say that, Charles Bloom, for instance, clearly identifies with Falstaff, and, that propels him through his entire book. And part of in writing my book, my primary motivation seems to be a disidentification with Falstaff. The kind of character I most disidentified with than Falstaff, which is probably to my credit. But giving you time to think about this, so the Shakespeare character.
No, I will answer this on behalf of Dick. It seemed to me he played the right role. Jakes is acerbic. He's highly intelligent. He knows a lot of what goes on. He's interested in everything. And instead of going back to the town, what's really interesting in him is this man who is living in a cave and has a sudden conversion. And that, by the way, happens to be Dick Posner's next book. It's about cave people.
Do you want to answer this for yourself? No. Well, I liked your example at the beginning of Rosalind, and I've always liked the women in the comedies who manage to defy the rules in a successful way. So, yeah, Rosalind has always been one that I've enjoyed playing, and I found Gertrude extremely difficult to play because she gives up everything so quickly, and she kind of breaks down in such a brief time. So then the question I had to ask myself is, why would she do that? No, I think when somebody you really love says these terrible things to you, that's quite different from just hearing them from a stranger. So that's how I tried to play it. But I do think that the stronger women are much more appealing.
No, I think Martha's sexy Gertrude was very well performed. But I don't see Gertrude that way. I see Gertrude as maternal. And I think what this is what I think Hamlet's problem is. So Hamlet is, at the beginning of the play, is a young man. He admires his father greatly. His father is, a kind of guy that a boy admires. What Hamlet is too young to realize is that his father is not a delightful husband, right? He's very stiff, and he's always off fighting, right? On the other hand, we know that Claudius is uxorious. He really loves Gertrude, and we know that he's politic and smooth, and he's very civilian, right? He's not going to go off fighting. So he's kind of more fun as a husband, but obviously Hamlet can't understand that, especially since he regards, I think correctly, Claudius as a murderer. So this is what I think gets Hamlet so terribly upset about his mother. His mother is a middle-aged woman. Now, it doesn't matter in terms of 16th century whether she's 40 or 50. She's middle-aged. From that perspective, Hamlet can't understand why this middle-aged woman is, clinging to Claudius and having sex with Claudius. Probably at his age, he thinks middle-aged women don't have sex unless there's something wrong with them. When he says the heyday and the blood is tame, it's humble, it waits upon the judgment. He's saying, what are you doing, sleeping with this toad, as he regards Claudius. So that, I think, is what horrifies him. Have inappropriate sexual activity by your own mother. That's disturbing, and it turns him against women in general. I don't think it's the sexual act as such that disgusts him. It's his mother having sex with his uncle murderer.
Does Richard want to answer the identification question?
Well, I want to say that I think, one of the things that immediately came into my mind is Eliot's brilliant early poem, in which we have the lines, "No, I'm not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be." I think there's a kind of egomania in thinking that any of us are likely to be reasonable facsimiles of Hamlet or Rosalind or these astonishing brilliant creatures. My sense would be maybe I could aspire to Horatio. Seems like an honorable... because after all, one of the things that Shakespeare does is give people this astonishing eloquence. And also in some cases astonishing other capabilities. So... and this is why Stoppard's play is important. It seems to me to sort of find a place for ordinary people, for people who are just ordinarily eloquent and ordinarily intelligent and ordinarily courageous, and ordinarily loyal, but are not Kent or Hamlet or Rosalind. Seems to me quite important. And so, again, Horatio seems to me a rather high goal. But it seems to me, at my best, I would maybe hope to be a loyal friend, maintain a fairly calm head, in a situation which, after all, is not mine. And perhaps be persuaded not to commit suicide with my friend and tell his story, which, as Justice Breyer said, is so extremely important at the end of that life. So I guess I think just recognizing how extraordinary these central characters are is important in sort of getting a reasonable sense of ourselves and ordinary human life.
Okay, there seem to be 3 people waiting at the mics, and I think that's about all we'll have time for before we adjourn to the reception. So why don't you go next? And introduce yourself, please, too. And maybe you can move the mic a little so we can actually see you. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Melanie Drummond-Hanson. I'm an 05 graduate at the law school. Hello.
Hello. Welcome back.
It seems to me that part of the disgust also with Hamlet and his mother is in seeing his mother as like everyone else. That, and this has to do in a sense with a disgust for class as well, where it seems that the lower classes are closer to the base or not as refined and able to control their more animal instincts and to separate themselves from that. So Hamlet is very disgusted to see his mother being like any other woman. He wants to see her as very particular and refined. And I think Shakespeare makes that contrast. And in the scene with Isabella, what's interesting to me is that Shakespeare kind of turns that notion on its head, and having a very refined and moved person appeal to Angelo to see within himself is universal with the criminal. And so I wonder, what is it that the law is meant to do this justice, to this sympathetic justice? Is it to see the very particular about the individual, or is it to see the individual as like everyone else?
Well, let me just answer about the women. That I think Edelman is right that Hamlet's disgust with his mother is the starting point, and he can't get away from the idea that there's something quite disgusting about having a mother who is sexual, and it's because of that he then projects all these disgust properties onto Ophelia. He doesn't know anything about Ophelia, and Ophelia, as far as we know, is perfectly properly behaved person, but he says to her, these terrible things about what women are like and what she's like, and I think that's all inspired by the view of his mother, and what he really wants, I think Edelman is right about this, is to, if he can make his mother pure again, then he himself can be freed from the stain that comes of being born of that, and that's what he's trying to do at the end of that scene, where he wants her to, just refuse and become a chaste woman again. So I don't know how that fits with your overall question about where we start, but I guess in terms of my interest, that I think the way that disgust is often irrational is that it starts from some anxiety that's extremely personal, and then it projects it in this global form onto all people of a certain type in a quite irrational way.
Why do you think? Ophelia. First of all, he loved Ophelia. Then Ophelia tells everything to her father and her brother, who say, stay away from him. So this woman he loves is staying away from him. We don't know quite how long, but it could be weeks. Then the next time he sees her, she says, I'm giving you back all your letters. Then he's perhaps looked up and seeing that Polonius has sent her to trap him. So she's part of this conspiracy too, or at least she's not a safe confidant. And under those circumstances where he wants his uncle to understand that he's going insane, he starts this speech. Now, I don't think that shows that he's disgusted either with Ophelia or with women. He is, if anything, obsessive about the problem of dealing with the revenge, which he's been told to do. And so I don't know. Probably you could argue that one both ways, but I didn't take it as inappropriate or showing something wrong with Ophelia.
Judge Posner, this morning about it being a mistake to take the magic and summarize Jane literally. So I wonder, and it can't just be that other people see him because other people see Bobby's transformation as well. So I wonder if you could say more, or from look under your face, it seems like I'm misunderstood.
Well, no, I think it's a fair question, but I think that Shakespeare goes out of his way to make it clear that this thing is not an illusion. I mean, Horatio, my current hero, is brought in as the skeptic, as someone who says, "Oh, pish pish, 'twill tush tush, 'twill not appear," and is completely skeptical, as many Elizabethans were, about ghosts, and is completely convinced. And these ordinary soldiers see the thing. So it seems to me just a very different, dramatic situation than what we get in Midsummer Night's Dream, where it seems to me Shakespeare is telling us to allegorize. I mean, the joke about bottom turning into an ass is like, gee, that's not much of a transformation. The guy was an ass to start with. And the flower, the magic potion being from a plant called Love in Idleness. Hint, hint, hint. And then you get jokes about people being wood within the wood, meaning mad with, where Shakespeare's just telling you how to allegorize. So I think that I think it's a fair question, but I think that the plays, in cases like this, tell you how to read them, and I think that we've got to be alert to how the play is telling us they want us to read something which is supernatural.
You just made me think who I'd like to be. I think I would like to be Owen Glendower. And my reason is because he can summon spirits from the vasty deep. Now, I'm often in dissent, and maybe that would help.
But remember what Shakespeare said. You can summon them, but will they come?
That's his problem.
Yeah, that's his problem.
So, Richard,
That's right.
I don't think you should settle for Horatio. Because
I aspire to Horatio.
No, you shouldn't. And the reason you shouldn't is that Horatio's role is to be the straight man. He's Costello to Hamlet's Abbot. And the reason is, or the function of Horatio, he's so straight, he's so dull, loyal retainer type, yes man, is that it really highlights Hamlet's extraordinary personality, his effervescence, his uncontrolled imagination, his wildness. And it would be less vivid if he didn't have this square attending him and trying to keep him a little bit under control.
Okay, last question. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Salih Carter. I'm a second year in the history graduate program. And I wanted to address, without going too far, the theme that I've heard presented by this panel, and that's the theme of music. A couple months ago I read in the New York Times about the appearance of musical lyrics in one of Roberts' opinions. You can't always get what you want in these cases. And more recently, in his panel discussion, Posner mentioned, Posner mentioned Hamlet being somewhat of a musical pattern score. And in Justice Breyer's book, he mentions the term musical score. And Kilmar's book, he mentions the great hits of the law. So I was wondering if the rest of the themes that might appear, musical themes, lyrical themes that might appear within your work, including the Shakespeare and one more request. So I'm sorry. I realized that the panel's going to be rushed after this event, and Justice Breyer wrote your book, Act of Liberty, and I was wondering if you could sign it.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you very much for the advertisement.
Would you like to comment on that?
On the music? Yeah. I Learned Hand said that. It's a good, and I use that quite often. He said interpreting statutes is like a player interpreting, a performer interpreting a musical score. He said you want to stay true to the statute. And staying true to the statute is something that can't easily be reduced. And here I couldn't agree with him more. It can't easily be reduced to a formula, any more than being true to the composer's intent can be reduced to a formula for a good performer. So he made that analogy, and I've thought of it from time to time. The other, which is a more theoretical book, but I found use for that along the theme you cite, is Claude Lévi-Strauss. I don't know if you know who that is. He's a French anthropologist who's written a lot about the stories of the South American Indian tribes. And he dedicates his book to music. And because he thinks, and this is true probably of the Romans, I mean the rhetoric school, that the form of the thing matters a lot. And he calls one chapter rondo, and then there's a sonata form. And I have thought of that from time to time, and people used to be taught that when they were in law school. And I'm glad I have just a passing familiarity with Cicero's account of rhetoric, which I have when I usually would cheat in Latin class and read the pony, but don't tell anyone. But I mean, those forms, which are abstract forms, I think matter a lot. Cicero, says start with the introduction and then say your theme and then have an elaboration, just like the sonata. And then the counter-argument, and then return to the summation. I think it helps.
I'm very interested in the theme of emotional expression in music, and I think, it's long been a puzzle for philosophers who work on it because they think, well, emotions seem to have some sort of cognitive content, but how can music have cognitive content? But actually, why should we think that it's only language that can have an intelligent structure, that can have expressive power? So that's the issue that interests me, is how to think about that issue of the expression of emotion in music and how to track that down in particular musical works. Do you want to answer that one?
One thing that occurs to me to say in general about Shakespeare and music is I think music is one of the very few things I can think of that seems to be invariably positive in Shakespeare's plays. I can't think of any negative music, although probably one of my learned colleagues will think of a case that I haven't thought of. But it's music tends to play a very positive symbolic role in the plays.
No, I think before we adjourn to the reception, does any of the panelists have any last remarks? First of all,
I've got to get Professor Strier off the Horatio line. So I'm going to quote a great essay by W.H. Auden, in which he summarizes the characters in Hamlet in a couple of sentences. He says, Laertes likes to be a dashing man of the world who visits all houses, but don't you touch my sister. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are yes men, and so on. And Horatio is not too bright, though he has read a lot and can repeat it.
You want to have a last word?
My last word, when to come back to our never-ending argument. Horatio speaks out in Act 1, Scene 4, tries to stop Hamlet from going to see the thing, because he's the one who says that, what if it tempt you toward the flood, my lord, or the dreadful summit of the cliff? He's worried that the thing is demonic and is going to tempt Hamlet to suicide. So in that case, he's not a yes man, and he believes the thing might be a demon.
I will give the last word to Justice Breyer.
Well, my last word would be to say thank you for inviting me here and for this afternoon. I mean, after we spend time reading these plays of Shakespeare and then spend an afternoon discussing them, we know that, well, will it really help us be better law students or better judges? And we think, well, it just might. It just might. So thank you very much.
Thank you.